In the late stages of the Cold War, the US Army found itself in a precarious situation. Russian tanks were suddenly becoming much more difficult to destroy, with the Soviets making rapid advances in armor technology. While heavier systems could still deal with them, lighter assets were not so fortunate, specifically infantry anti-tank weapons and air deployable vehicles. The Soviets also invested heavily in explosive reactive armor, which made things much more difficult. This type of armor is especially effective against chemical effect rounds, such as shaped charges. Lighter platforms typically use shaped charges, because they don't use launch energy to destroy a target. Instead, the penetrator is formed when the warhead strikes the target plate. Not only does this essentially nullify recoil, but it's also more versatile. Anyway, back to the issue at hand. While the Army began investigating more complicated approaches like top attack missiles, they also decided to examine some more brute force methods. If chemical effect rounds wouldn't work, then they would simply use kinetic ones. There was one issue though. You can't expect paratroopers to drag around a tank gun. And even for vehicles like the MA-AGS, with the newest 105 tank ammo, they might have trouble with future threats. So how do you get around this problem? With kinetic energy missiles. Kinetic energy missiles, or CKEMs, are hypervelocity rockets with a heavy metal penetrator in the nose. Basically no different from the penetrators used by tank shells. Not only would this essentially nullify explosive reactive armor, but it would be immune to active protection systems, allow units to outrange Soviet tanks, and be cheaper than conventional ATGMs. One of the first CKEMs wasn't a missile at all, but an unguided rocket. It was called the Spike Hypervelocity Rocket, not to be confused with the modern Israeli missile. Envisioned as a way to give helicopters more punch against light vehicles, the Spike was a relatively light rocket, and it used a small tungsten penetrator. Its velocity was in the ballpark of 5,000 feet per second, or about 1,500 meters per second. It was highly accurate for a rocket, and would have been much cheaper than guided anti-tank missiles. A multi-flechette version was also under development, and would have been used against helicopters as well, but Spike was never adopted. Even with its high accuracy and low cost, it was still more effective to simply use guided missiles, such as the new Hellfire. The concept was still promising, but one thing was clear: it would need to be guided. Luckily, such a missile was already under development. The Air Force had contracted Vought, one of America's oldest aerospace corporations, to develop a cheaper alternative to the Maverick air-to-ground missile. The Maverick is a vaunted missile today, but in the early 80s, it was not seen as a good long-term option. It had undergone numerous program delays, continued to have technical problems, and while it was relatively cheap, it was expected the costs would soar as the program dragged on. Vought's answer was called the HVM, or Hypervelocity Missile. It would also fly at around 5,000 feet per second, but would use laser beam guidance. This meant that multiple HVMs could be guided at once. It was around 9 centimeters in diameter, so larger than a Hydra, but smaller than a Zuni. There's not much information on the penetrator. Some sources say it was depleted uranium, others say tungsten. At around 4 kilometers, its range was pretty short for an air-to-ground missile, but it promised to make up for it with low cost, higher payload potential, and high lethality, even against the most modern MBTs. One HVM pod, designed for use with aircraft, contained 40 missiles and the fire control system. Vought also claimed that the HVM could be mounted on ground vehicles, such as tanks or MLRS platforms. This piqued the interest of the other branches. The HVM itself wasn't adopted, but it would continue development as a new missile, line of sight anti-tank or LOSAT. Development began in the late 80s, under the Advanced Anti-Tank Weapon System Heavy program. The goal of the program was to replace the TOW missile, providing greater range and lethality. Compared to HVM, LOSAT was both larger and more capable. There is very little information on the penetrator it used, but it may have been based on some 140mm rounds. In the case of one of the penetrators mentioned, it was 78 centimeters in length, which would make it incredibly powerful. It would have been able to destroy any tank that was in use, or about to be in use, which is exactly what was claimed about the missile. Its exact range isn't known, but it's somewhere around the 4 or 5 kilometer mark. It used the same guidance system as HVM, but for acquisition and tracking, it used second generation thermals. A number of LOSAT platforms were envisioned, including one for the Bradley, one for the MA-AGS, and one for the Humvee. A follow-on program called ADKEM, or Advanced Kinetic Energy Missile, was developed at the same time. ADKEM would have been vertically launched, and would have had an almost meter-long penetrator. Though LOSAT was successful in testing, it was believed it was too bulky, so it was dropped in favor of a new missile called CKEM, also made by Lockheed Martin. CKEM was much lighter than LOSAT, almost 80 pounds lighter, and to make up for this lighter weight, it had much greater velocity. It was supposed to reach velocities in excess of Mach 6, or over 2,000 meters per second. CKEM was also never adopted. Thanks to the effectiveness of the Javelin, and a distinct lack of tanks to shoot, there wasn't much need for it. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed learning about this neat technology, and I'll see you on the next one.